Hello, my name is Eric Smith, and I chose to do my informative speech about the Bay of Pigs invasion. Just a quick overview of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Who was fighting in the Bay of Pigs invasion? It's the U.S. with Kennedy and Cuba with Castro. What was the purpose? The purpose was for the U.S. to attempt to overthrow Cuba and their communist regime. Where was it? The Bay of Pigs in Cuba. When was this? In April of 1961. Why? Because the U.S. was afraid of the communistic spread from the Soviet Union. And the result was a failed invasion and John F. Kennedy taking most of the blame. Here's a quick time overview of the Bay of Pigs invasion. It starts out in 1959 with Fidel Castro overthrowing Cuba. Castro's threat to the United States. Castro had a very close link with the Soviet communists, which the U.S. didn't like. So in turn, we prevented economic aids into Cuba and didn't help them at all. Nationalists from Cuba were anti-American people who had movements against the capitalistic ways of America. They wanted to take over the U.S. companies in Cuba to make them their own companies, so the U.S. couldn't make any profits off the country. In 1960, Eisenhower administration authorized the CIA's plan to overthrow Castro. Planning the invasion, the CIA would train Cuban exiles in Guatemala. They would do this so they can send them back and no one would expect anything different. So when they tried to overthrow them, it'd be a complete shock to them. They'd have the familiar advantage of knowing the country's layout and how everything works, unlike American operatives landing in the country. There were almost 1,400 troops. They hoped to form good relations with these troops, but it didn't turn out as well as they thought. 1961, JFK becomes the President of the United States. JFK plans, the Eisenhower plans were briefly transferred to JFK. They were very loose interpretations of what Eisenhower wanted to do with it. Kennedy was pressured into the Bay of Pigs invasion mission, even though he had his advisors warn him against it, to not do it, and how it could be a tactical failure for him and his administration. And later on, we'll see how that failed him. In 1961, in April of 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion starts. But also in October of 1961, before JFK takes the office, Castro was already informed of the plan by Cuban operatives. Here's the location of the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. It's right around here. And here's Cuban operatives on the coast. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a big failure, only lasting about 3 days. The forces were not armed good. The U.S. did not help them arm properly, so they were out on their own. 1,100 of the 1,400 people were killed or captured by the Cubans. The aftermath of the invasion was that the prisoners from the invasion were kept in captivity for 20 months or longer until a settlement was reached between Castro and JFK. JFK took most of the blame for the failure, even though it wasn't his plan most of the time. It strengthened Castro's rule in Cuba, making him more likable for the Cuban people to rebel against America even harder. 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis starts. My sources included the Bay of Pigs invasion manual from the Cold War Museum, the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library Museum, History.com and A&E television networks about the Bay of Pigs invasion, and the Bay of Pigs invasion and its aftermath Office of Historians, the U.S. Department of State, and Peter B. Randy Roberts and Alan Taylor's Kennedy and the Cold War book on how it began and how it started. Thank you. I hope you learned something.